Hey, and welcome back to Money for Life. My name is Kaylee Roberge.
And I'm Eric Roberge.
And if you're newer to the podcast, just a quick reminder that what we do is run a financial planning firm based out of Boston called Beyond Your Hammock. And we work with people who are in their 30s and 40s and usually have young kids at home and really demanding high-powered careers. And we do financial planning and investment management for those families. But we also do it for ourselves because we kind of are one of those families. We're very, very similar to the clients that we work with.
It's nice to be able to be empathetic with the type of client that we work with because we're dealing with some of these same things. So I'm excited to talk through what we consider our order of operations and the things that we think are absolutely necessary to do throughout the year to stay on track and up to date and be proactive with your money.
Right. And you've probably heard that advice a lot, that one of the best things that you can do, especially if you have a partner, is to sit down with them and have a money date or something like that once a month. But in a lot of that advice, it doesn't really get into what that means. Like when you sit down with your computers and you pull up your whatever you're using to track your money, what even is that? That advice doesn't dig into what next once you're sitting down with your glass of wine or whatever you like to drink with your spouse or your partner. Now what? How do you go over that? So that's what we want to dig into today, is to share from our perspective as financial advisors who work with clients who are, in this stage of life. What is it that we do with our own personal finances? To start, a lot of the times the advice is you have a money date once a month. So for us, the timing is really important. And we do this financial meeting with ourselves once every quarter because that's more fitting with the timing of how we get paid. And for our clients, it's very similar because they're getting a monthly paycheck perhaps, but they're also getting grants of RSUs, they're getting bonuses and commissions. So you don't necessarily have to do this, every month. You can choose the timing that works best for you.
I think if you're looking at this big picture, it's what is going to be the biggest impact. No one has time to waste time. And therefore, we need to make sure that we're doing the things that are going to move the needle most. So this conversation really, big picture, is about comprehensive planning. But if we're going to talk about this, it's annual cash flow and how to stay on top of it, how to optimize it, how to make the choices that you're considering with that cash flow very impactful to your life, whether that means spending powerfully for today or it means investing powerfully for tomorrow. It's all right here in this conversation.
Yeah. And having these check-ins for us, again, it's every quarter, that helps us plan out, the next 3 months and what that's going to look like on a monthly or even a day-to-day basis. But having this quarterly meeting as the structure and the backbone of that makes it easier to make financial decisions along the way. And it makes it easier, and in my opinion, to manage the money day to day. And that's partly because of where we start. So in the advice that we give to clients, one of the big hallmarks, big foundational pieces is savings rate. How much are you saving? And whenever Eric and I sit down to have these planning meetings with ourselves, that's where we start too, is how much do we need to save? And of the money that, we have coming in, that's the first thing that gets set aside, is that number to meet the savings rate.
And we think about savings rate, I think we should step back a second and say, well, what is our savings rate? Why is it what it is? And how did we come up with that? And really, if you take a step back further than that and look at the way that I'm envisioning this is kind of like what I was doing yesterday, right? We had the Patriots game was on and the Denver Broncos game was on. I'm not a huge football fan, but I knew that if the Patriots won, Denver had to lose for them to be in first place in the AFC for the playoffs. And the split screen was awesome for that. I could watch both games at once and not toggle back and forth. So when you're thinking about this conversation for you in a year, what you should be envisioning is a split screen. One of them is short-term cash flow, right? The annual up to 5 years of cash flow. What does that look like for you? And what are you planning for from a spending perspective? That spending can be everything from a day-to-day thing. It could be a car purchase. It could be a home down payment. It could be a big trip. Like big, chunky expenses need to be considered in that realm. On the other screen is the long-term projection to say, what trajectory are we on financially? How is our wealth growing over time? And hopefully, why, right? So like retirement and college and other longer-term big picture goals for your life. And if you have both of them split screen, one of them short-term cash flow, one of them long-term financial trajectory, now you're in the right mindset to come down to the operations of it all. And Kaylee, as you said, the savings rate is the driver of the conversations that we have from a where does cash flow go next perspective. And so we've come up with a savings rate that is generally 25% of gross income as an anchor point, right? We can swing lower or higher from that point depending on the situation, but that is our baseline.
I think the savings rate is also the bridge between those two imaginary screens that you were just talking about with short-term and long-term. Inherently, those are competing priorities, but the savings rate is what helps you kind of bring those things into harmony. Because if you have your set savings rate, which is based on what you need for that long-term to be successful, then that sets what you can do with your short-term. Because if you put in the savings rate and you've set that money aside, then if you're just talking big picture, right, theoretically, you can do whatever you want with what's left over in the short term. So I think that's how, in my mind anyway, I think about resolving the conflict that can be there between short-term and long-term money management. And that's why the order of operations matters so much. Because if you're saving first, like, all right, you've got that locked in, you've taken care of kind of that long-term vision. Now what's left over and what choices can I make for the short term?
Yeah, that is the simplest way. And that's the one number budget, right? If we set our savings rate and we know how much we need to save, everything else can be spent. So you don't have to nickel and dime yourself on the spending side if you don't like that, which I don't. I want to know how much do I need to save? And therefore, by default, everything else is available to use, to spend, to enjoy life, to expand lifestyle, or just decide to do certain things on a weekly, monthly, annual basis.
Yeah. And I think the exact savings rate is important there. And there's a couple things to that, right? Because we're saying savings rate, you said 25%. I think that percent part of it is important because instead of using a dollar amount, you're using a percentage, which keeps it relative to your income. So if your income goes up, if you're saving a percentage of that income, then your savings goes up too. And that's a really good way to guard against lifestyle inflation. And you're just, every time you get a raise, well, your spending raises too. So keeping it as a percentage works the other way. Also, if your income goes down, then your savings rate by dollars is going to drop too, which makes sense if you're making less money. And that way you're not getting yourself in a very frustrating position where you're trying to meet this savings goal that might not fit your financial situation as well anymore. So the percentage keeps it relevant to what you're earning. And as far as choosing the exact number, I'm curious for you, Eric, because we recommend this to our clients too, right? We're taking our own advice. That 25% number is kind of your gold standard. Why is that? Why have you settled on, your years of experience advising people? Why is that the number?
As you said, there's a couple of different reasons for that. One, I've never run a long-term projection where someone is, 40 years old or under, and they save 25% of their gross income until age 60 to 65 years old. Never run a projection where that fails, where they run out of money by age 100 if they're saving at that rate, right? That is a significant amount of money. Obviously, the earlier you start at that rate, the better. But if you're in your 20s, it's kind of hard to get to 25% oftentimes because you're making less money and it's expensive typically where you live. If you're around Boston or New York or San Fran or Chicago, kind of the places where our clients live. So targeting 25% is going to give you very powerful long-term growth, savings rate plus a decent rate of return of 6 to 8% in your investments is going to give you a nice chunk of change to retire on. That's baseline. And then two, it's more of a cash flow health perspective. So I was thinking about this yesterday, and you don't necessarily need to save 25% all the time, but just like with my health, right? If I'm going out to dinner and I'm getting a cheeseburger 3 times a week, right? That to me is probably fine to do from a health perspective. And I might live just as long as I would if I didn't eat 3 burgers a week. However, there's still a chance that it's not going to do well for my body because generally burgers aren't that healthy. Red meat isn't that healthy to eat all the time. So I'd rather not eat as much cheeseburger and focus in on more of a healthy diet. So when it comes to cash flow, looking at it like cash flow health, it's just what makes you feel good. One, right? Burgers don't necessarily make me feel good, but also what is going to be the best choice for longevity and just being flexible and the ability to maneuver over time, financially speaking in this case. And so when you have a 25% savings rate, that's a good buffer. In tough times, you can shrink it down because your cash flow, even if it lowers, like there's still some buffer room in there where if you don't save anything, you have a lot of money you can pull back into your cash flow to spend. But it's more that ability to not have your lifestyle significantly interrupted when things pop up that either you want to do, like I want to spend more this year, or I can't do something because my cash flow has been restricted because I lost my job or something else happens. It just gives you a more consistent long-term cash flow management setup.
So it sounds like that 25% number really strikes a good balance between you're saving what you need to make it long term, but you're not pushing yourself so hard as to make it unsustainable. Like you can't maintain that rate forever. And I think that is a problem. I think it's less of a problem than overspending, but oversaving can be a challenge. And I think we were kind of bumping up on that for a couple of years. I wouldn't necessarily go back and change any of it, but there were a couple of years where we were saving 40% of our income. And when I look back at those years, we didn't do a lot. Like, we did not go on vacation. We did not travel. We did not have the kinds of experiences that we've had since then. And again, I wouldn't necessarily change it because that gave us a really nice head start because we did it early on and we did that pretty aggressively, which gave us a mechanism to back off a little bit and not disturb the long term. So I think there are advantages to kind of front loading your savings if you can and you want to do it.
I think it's important to do one thing as well. When you're talking about like we weren't necessarily spending as much as we could have and we're saving a lot, I think that it was connected to just money mindset in general. I didn't come from a place where we could just splurge on everything all the time, right? And saving money wasn't necessarily something my parents did early on, but they didn't spend a bunch of money either. They just didn't make a ton. And so in my 20s, I felt like I was at that place where I couldn't spend a lot of money because I wasn't making a ton. I started to make more and I started to save a little bit of money, but I wasn't ever comfortable with that line. Where is the line between spending too much and spending too little, saving too much and saving too little? And so when I started my business, I had this same mindset of like, well, I don't have enough money to spend a lot. I got to save a lot. And that was true for a while. But then we blew through the point where it's like, all right, well, we don't have to save as much money dollar for dollar anymore. We can start to spend a little bit of that money. But I never trained myself on spending because I never felt like I could freely spend on things that I wanted. It was always, well, that's the best thing. I have to go for the lower thing on the list, like not the top quality, but the second most quality in order to maintain cash flow for myself. But suddenly that switched. And I think that's what we realized. We realized one, all right, we're saving a lot of money now. And two, the mindset that got us here isn't necessarily the one that's going to take us to the next level. And the next level, yes, growing wealth, but also spending in a way that fits your income. I don't know how else to say that, but that's what I'm feeling like. There's a power to the cash flow that you eventually have if you're growing your income. And to realize that power, you have to change your mindset from a place of scarcity to abundance.
No, it's always a fine line though, isn't it? Because it's so easy to tip over into like, oh, I have so much more than I ever did before. Now I can afford all these things that I couldn't afford before. And I think sometimes people fall into that trap of like, now they have so much more choice that they can actually make the choice. Whereas before the money just wasn't there. So it was like, I'm not even going to go there. And so it's almost like you need a training ground of how to spend well. And people don't really talk about that a lot, of how to spend well and how to still keep it responsible, even though you do have literally more money to use. So I think going back to that, the savings rate, that's why it's such a helpful mechanism, is because you've got your percentage and it's tied to your income. So as your income goes up, your savings goes up, but your spending can too, right? Because you didn't change the dollar amount necessarily. You were keeping it relative with the percentage. And also, again, this is all been like a big tangent on, this is just the first thing that we start on is like, all right, the savings rate, let's calculate what is 25% of our income. And we have to invest that and set it aside.
Correct. Yeah. So the savings rate, kind of bring it back home here. Savings rate is the first thing we do. We set aside the amount of money that we have predetermined that we need to save on an annual basis, broken up by quarter, to achieve our long-term goals.
And then after that, we look at how much we need to set aside for taxes, which isn't necessarily something that everyone will have to do, because if you're employed, then your employer is withholding that. But it is a consideration if you have something like RSUs that is pushing your ordinary taxable income rate up. You might need to set aside proceeds, especially if you've sold vested RSUs, and keep that in cash for your tax bill next April, or potentially to make estimated tax payments.
Correct. I mean, that's as a side note, right? With the restricted stock units, they typically, the default tax rate is 22% federal. So if your tax bracket is above that, you're leaving a gap between what you're actually paying when they vest and what you need to pay at the end of the year. Right. So I think that's what you were referencing there. So making sure that you're getting ahead on your taxes, or at least staying current on your taxes, so you don't get this huge tax bill at the end. Whether it's, something like the RSUs are vesting, or it's you're paying estimated quarterly payments that are above and beyond your paycheck taxes that you need to save for. So in our case, it's the estimates. Like, we know that every quarter we have to pay a certain amount of dollars to estimated taxes, both federally and state, to stay current and not pay penalties at the end of the year, and certainly not get stuck with a huge tax bill, because we are not taxed on our distributions from the business that we run.
Right. And the reason that's second in the order of operations behind savings is because, to a certain degree, like, you can't control taxes. You don't get to choose how much you pay in taxes. That's obligatory. So we want to put that in as the second thing behind savings rate. That's integral to that philosophy of paying yourself first. Like, savings, even though, no, the government isn't telling me I have to save in the same way I have to pay taxes, we're going to prioritize that first, even if it's just like a mental thing of like, that's where I'm saying that is so important that I'm putting it first and putting it ahead of taxes. So when you sit down to do, your planning, your money management for the month or the quarter, savings rate first, taxes second, and then we can look at baseline fixed expenses. And that's where we go next.
Yeah. And just, I think it's key to understand that we're talking about proactive, right? So we're meeting to talk about future spending, because we've taken some money out of the business as a distribution. So think of if you're thinking about this and you don't have a business, you have a bonus, right? In the spring, you get a huge bonus that comes in, it's sitting in your bank account. That's probably the time to do the planning for the next segment of the year. Either it's the whole year because you have a massive bonus that comes in, or if it's a quarterly bonus or a quarterly commission or a quarterly RSU vest, you have extra money that's come in. You want to do the planning for that next several months with this money sitting in your bank account, so it doesn't just go away, sink into the sand, because you haven't done anything on the planning front, and therefore all the money is sitting in your checking and you feel like you can just spend, and that's actually what you end up doing. Right? So getting in front of that to be more intentional about your cash flow. That's why we do it this way, looking forward the next 3 months.
Right. And we start with, again, the fixed expenses, which aren't necessarily something like forward. They're always there, right? And that's the point. They're always there. Whatever is going to happen in the next 3 months, you still have to pay your mortgage or your rent. You still have to buy your groceries. You still have to do those things. So it's important to have like a baseline budget and to make sure that you're capturing anything that's fixed that is, again, out of your control doesn't sound right, but I'm thinking things that are like bills, your cell phone bill, again, your rent or your mortgage, your utilities, things that you have to pay. It is not an option. It is part of your financial obligations and responsibilities. That's kind of your baseline budget that you want to have. So that's what we look at. And we don't necessarily adjust it or change it a lot. We do review it kind of quickly to make sure, like, does this all still make sense? Are these things actually tracking with how we're really spending? Because a budget is just, words on paper. If you're not following it or you're not tracking faithfully to those categories, it's probably not doing you much good.
So we were saying too, I think breaking it down into we've talked about savings, taxes, and now general monthly costs that we have, expenses that we have. And inside of that monthly expenses, there's the fixed things that are the rent, the mortgage, the whatever. And then there's the variable piece of that is like groceries and going out to dinner and maybe like local travel, things like that. Like, those stay pretty consistent for us as well. We're not saying like, oh, this quarter, it's going to be a massive shift in our normal spending on those categories. We have a general consistency there. So we're saying normal monthly expenses includes fixed and variable expenses. And that is what we're budgeting for the next 3 months.
Yeah. And I can go through, like, just to be specific. So we have mortgage in here. We have utilities, electric and gas. We keep childcare separate, but that might be a monthly expense. The reason that we do it separate is the way that our daughter's school charges us. Basically, we pay them 6 months out of the year and we don't pay them another 6 months. So we just keep it as a separate, its own standalone thing. And again, that illustrates, like, do you want to do it that way? I don't know. Does it work for you? So there's lots of variability here. It's not saying that this is the one right way to organize it, but it's more to get you thinking of like, this is one way you could think about it. And the system that works best is the one that you stick with. And we also have HOA in there. So those are like what we're calling our total quote unquote fixed expenses, our needs. These are not wants, these are just things that it costs to live. And then we have a different section that is also needs based. It's things you need, but it's variable. So you do have some influence, you exert some control over this. So that's things like groceries, transportation, gas, train tickets, that sort of thing. Stuff around the house that we need, like cleaners, paper towels, cat litter. And then we have in here a line item for our daughter. And that's changed. It's always been in there since she's been born, but the exact things changes. Like at first it was diapers and formula, and now it's new socks and, shampoo. So she always needs something. So that's why we just have a big thing in there of like her stuff. That's the line item. It's definitely a need, but it changes month to month, and we can exert some control over how much is getting spent. The next section of the regular budget is getting into wants, things that are not required. They're not necessities. They're not bills, but they're regular things that we are choosing to spend on. That for us, the breakdown is restaurants, shopping. We've got our gym membership in there. We've got our streaming stuff, which is Netflix, Spotify, Prime, and Disney. We have a line item for vitamins and pills because you would not believe the amount that everybody in the family takes, including the cat. We also have a line item for house cleaning in here because I think that's important for us, but we understand it's in this regular choice spending category because we understand it's not a strict need. It is a want, but it is important. And then we have a line item for gifts. So what we do is each quarter, we set aside a certain amount of money that goes into a slush fund that we can pull from throughout the year for things like birthday gifts, Christmas, etc. And then at the very bottom of our standard budget, we have a section specifically for insurance and additional taxes, which in this case is mostly the car excise tax. But we have home insurance, we have umbrella insurance, we have long-term disability for both of us, we have life insurance, term life for both of us. And then again, we have the car excise tax. So all of those specifics are what make up our quote unquote normal budget. These are the things that are going to kind of run every month, every quarter, and we can pretty much rely on like, this is how much it is. This is what it is. It's pretty predictable. No surprises here.
I think one of the areas that people get tripped up on is the non-monthly spending. Because if it's not being spent monthly, yet it's in your budget on a monthly or quarterly basis, for example, like the homeowner's insurance, you actually need to actively take the money out of your bank account, your checking account, into your savings account so that it's there when you need it. Annually, it's $3,000 a year, whatever this expense is. That means you have to save $250 a month. And that means you move the $250 a month or a quarter into a separate account so it's there when the bill comes. Oftentimes what people do is they do a great job of setting the budget, but then for those items that aren't spent monthly, they don't actually move the money to a separate place to have available the funds when the bill comes, so that when the bill comes, they're still taking extra money from their normal cash flow, and that puts them back in that month spending. You don't have to do that. You just have to be proactive about segmenting and chunking the money aside, which is why I love to do it on a quarterly basis, because you do it 4 times a year, not monthly. But also when it comes to bonuses, that bonus is once a year and you get $250,000 as a bonus. Separate it all now. Fund college, fund this, fund that. And then you're done for the year and you've put all the money where you needed to put it to be able to pay for the things that you said were most important that were outside your normal monthly spending.
And that's definitely part of this meeting is what we do is once we identify these things, then we pull out the money into its own account. And I have a spreadsheet that tracks like, this is how much we have set aside for insurance. This is how much we have set aside for the school tuition. This is how much we have set aside for our utilities, the house cleaning, all of that. And what we do, again, it doesn't necessarily matter exactly what you do as long as you are doing it. And that's a big benefit of the meeting, like having that regularly scheduled meeting where you can sit down and do all these tasks is really, really helpful. What we do is we have just one savings account and we have all of our cash pooled in there because it's got a pretty good interest rate. And if all the money is in one place earning that good interest rate, then it's more money in our pocket. But that means you have to track, because if you have a big pile of money, but you had everything we just ran through of like, all right, we have a slush fund for that. then you need a way to track which dollars are for what thing. So I have a spreadsheet that just separates out all these quote unquote slush funds. If that's too much work for you, that's totally fine. You can use a different system. I like Capital One for that because you can open like a bajillion different savings accounts and you can see them all together in one place. So if it's easier for you to visually see all your money in separate places earmarked for these specific things, that's great if it works for you. And it's totally worth losing out on some amount of interest if it's actually going to have your money managed better, I think, anyway.
Yeah. Well, in Capital One, though, as you used as an example, all the accounts get the same interest rates. You're not losing out at all. It's still above 3% right now. I don't know if it's 3.2 or 3.3 or 3.4, but it's all getting the same interest rate because there's no minimums to get the certain interest rate. So that works for Capital One because you can open all the accounts, you can get the same interest rate at $1 for your money. But like you mentioned, we don't like that. We like one account and we just use a spreadsheet to divide up what the money's for. Either way is fine.
Yeah. That takes us through, again, just to recap, savings rate first, your obligatory taxes second, your fixed costs and bills, things that it's just your cost of living. It is what it is. And then within that chunk of change, you've got your regular stuff that you know and you can predict, whether it's yearly or quarterly, however it's paid, you know it's coming. So you can break it up in your regular budget, set it aside as needed. And you've even got some choice spending in there, like restaurant shopping. Again, things you know you were going to do, but are just kind of broad categories that are difficult to nail down precisely the day at which you will go out to this restaurant or the week you're going to go shop for this item. And then for us, that leaves us to kind of the everything else bucket, which is really nice if you do it this way because you know you've saved, you've set aside the money that you have to for fixed expenses you can't control, and now you have what's left over. And you can choose what you do with that money, whether that's saving or investing more, or whether it's funding a short-term goal. And I should say that was one thing I think we missed in this because I don't think we have any big short-term goals right now, but setting aside cash for short-term goals and how that's different than your savings rate. Can you dig into that a little bit, Eric?
Yeah. The savings rate specifically, when we talk about it, is going to be the long-term savings rate. So the money that you're investing, it's going into growth assets to invest for the long term. And I say that because the money not only gets moved aside and not spent, but it's being invested in a way that there's a compound effect to the growth of that money. In the beginning, when I said, I've never seen someone that has a 25% savings rate for 20 plus years that can't live well in retirement for their retirement, that was assuming they were investing at, like I said, I think before, 6 to 8% annual compound rate of return, because that's where the growth and the wealth accumulation comes from. And so if you're saving for something short term, it's not getting that compound effect because by default, you're using it before it compounds. And so if it's a house down payment for your next primary residence, or if it's a car or it's a college payment, those things need to be saved for, and that's not part of your 25% long-term savings rate.
Yeah, I think for us, we would still, this order of operations still holds because I think we would take care of the savings rate, the invested for long-term money first, taxes, fixed expenses, like what we need to live. And then with this pool of what's left over money, we would be funding a short-term goal like travel. Travel is often something that we are like slowly, continually funding at each time we sit down and do this. I might save $1,000 here, $500 there, so that for our next trip, again, we had like that slush fund of money that we can pull from, and it's just being slowly added to over time because we know that travel is something that's important to us, so we're kind of continually trying to add to it. College savings is another thing for us that goes in this bucket. And I think we want to maximize flexibility. So we, at the moment anyway, are not going crazy on how much we're contributing to our daughter's 529 plan. We contribute consistently, same amount each quarter, but it's not like trying to max it out or go nuts on that because we're prioritizing getting as much as we can into like a brokerage account instead, knowing that, yes, there are tax advantages with 529 plans, but we like the flexibility and the idea of paying for college through multiple different sources, whether it's 529, cash flow at the time she goes to college, our brokerage account, we can pull from different sources.
Yeah. And so that's the short-term savings segment of the cash flow planning process.
Right. And then in addition to short-term goals, it's well, what do you just want to have? Like, do you need a new set of golf clubs? Do you want to go get a massage? That sort of thing comes into this last little bucket. And I think it makes sense to do your short-term goals, even if they're really important with this, what do I want to spend money? Because that's really what a short-term goal is. It's not necessarily savings. It's kind of like delayed spending. Like you're trying to accumulate cash to spend. You're not spending it today. You're just spending it at a slightly later date. So to me, anyway, it makes sense to kind of put this stuff together at the end because then you can, I think, make better trade-offs when you're comparing these two things together, because then you can ask yourself, how important is it for me to save up for a new car versus buy a new Apple Watch right now? Like you might, when you have all these things laid out on the table together, like, here's the stuff that I want, then you can easily say like, well, the car right now is more important to me. So let me take that $700 and push it toward that fund versus spending it today on like a new watch.
Yeah. Let's be clear. Like this bucket is everybody's favorite bucket. If you're doing this process, you get to the end, you're hoping that you have excess above all of your very specific things like normal spending and savings, because then you can literally just choose, like shooting fish in a bucket. Like, what do I want to spend on now that I wouldn't normally think about spending on, but I really, really want it. And now I have the money to do so because I just proved it through my planning process. Let's go do it. So it's an exciting bucket to have. And it's not always flush with money, depending on how well you did the quarter or how big the bonus was or whatever. But it's money that should be put at the end and not the beginning. And that's where a lot of people go wrong. Putting this, what do I want to spend on in the beginning to say like, well, it's part of my lifestyle spending. And you put your long-term savings at the end. And if there's nothing left, there's nothing left. And so when you're having the conversation, if this bucket is in the beginning, the extra spending bucket is in the beginning, and you're having a conversation about car versus trip versus new gym equipment for your basement, you have enough money for all of it because you're starting with it. So you end up spending all of it, get to the end, oh, my long-term savings, we'll just knock off a little bit of our long-term savings. Not that important. We have 20 years to go. That's where people get screwed. They're not doing the savings first. And it's sometimes they meet their long-term savings goals. Sometimes they don't. And they always blame, these spending items popped up. Well, no, you chose them to pop up. Granted, there are emergencies that pop up. And if you don't have the proper emergency reserves, you have to take them from somewhere. But if you're doing the right planning and you have your emergency reserves set aside and you're doing the right order of operations, by the end, it's the choice spending that suffers if there's not enough to go around, not the very important retirement or college or long-term goals that matter.
Yeah, I like this setup too for that. I think it's a little bit more painful in a good way if you're overspending on your day-to-day expenses, because if you get to the bottom here and you're like, oh, I don't have as much left over as I want for these other things I want to buy, then there's more motivation, I think, to go back and look at your normal budget and see like, all right, what's going on here? Is there anything that I can cut? Is there something that I'm doing in this area that's getting in the way of what's actually more important over here? And I think it is also a good thing to see that like, oh, I missed out on this thing that I wanted. It's easier to change your behavior to get the thing that you want versus if you leave the savings toward the end, it's way easy to be like, oh, this is just this one time. It's just this 1 month. It's just this one quarter. Next time I'll save. Well, no, you're not. You're going to repeat the process because there's no pain in the moment when you're not saving. Like no one is suffering because you didn't save money. But if you are missing out on like this thing that I really wanted and I'm not getting closer to that goal, or I'm not funding this trip that I wanted, that's creating pain. And I mean that in a good, like it sounds bad, but it's a positive thing because it's getting you to actually change your behavior versus the only person that suffers when you don't save is future you. And you don't know who that person is. Like that person feels nothing right now, but they certainly will if you don't make an adjustment. So I think there's some psychological things that are built into this process that make it more effective. Like you said, if you leave the savings to the end, nothing's going to change with that because you don't have to, because you're living your life day to day, but you're trying to plan for the long term.
Yeah, it's the healthy friction. You need that healthy friction to make it work. And if you're working out and you're doing sprints, like I don't know anybody that actually likes the 10th sprint, the middle of the 10th sprint that they're doing when they're just dying, right? They like the end result of that. So you have to understand where the pain needs to happen and put it appropriately so that you're motivated to go through that pain in order to get to the other side and revel in the abundance, right? And again, it's just like be able to feel the benefit of the we're saying pain, but it's not, it's that friction, that healthy friction that you're implementing because you know it's good for you. If you're not going to do that, you're just going to live in a world of bacchanalia all the time, whether it's your food, your drink, your spending, then you're going to suffer the consequences at some time. I'm not willing to do that. I want to have a structure in a way that allows me to feel good about the choices I'm making and to live powerfully at all times and know that I have the funds to be able to do that, whether it's today or tomorrow. And it's this healthy friction that allows us to do that. We have the meetings, we have a very specific process that we go through to get to what we need to in the order of priority that we say, again, we say is most important. So you say what is most important for you, we say what's most important for us, but here's the structure that gets to those things for us.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Money for Life, hosted by Eric Roberge, CFP and founder of Beyond Your Hammock, and me, Kaylee Roberge. Our show is produced and edited by Steve Stewart. If you want to learn more about wealth management and hiring your own personal financial advisor, visit beyondyourhammock.com. And now for the legal stuff. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice, and may not cover all critical, complete details of every situation discussed. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the host or the podcast. Please consult a qualified professional about your specific situation before making any financial decisions based on this podcast or any other educational content designed for a general audience.